So I now have the pleasure of properly introducing Alison Dunn from Gateshead Council and Citizens Advice Gateshead. So Gateshead launched their Warm Spaces offer in September, and Alison really is the perfect person to share how that's been done, as she's the staff member that's been leading this project. So Alison, hello.
Hi, good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thanks so much for joining us today, Alison. We've got a lot to get through, so I'm just going to dive straight in there with our opening question, if that's okay.
That's fine.
So before we kick off looking at how you've set up your Warm Spaces programme, I think a really important kind of a backdrop to this is your dual role. So I wondered if you could just tell us a little bit about your dual role and why that's been so important in setting the project up.
Yeah, so as we've already said, I am the Chief Officer of Citizens Advice, but I'm also a Service Director in local government. And it is a dual role. It's not a secondment. It is literally me looking at both roles at all times. So the reason for that is that both organisations recognise after a decade of collaboration that we have the same vision and aspirations for our residents, actually. Citizens Advice wants to eradicate poverty, disadvantage, wants an equal society, as does our local authority. So we might articulate those things slightly differently, but we have absolutely the same aims and objectives. And there was a recognition that Gateshead is an area of high deprivation and that poverty and reducing inequality was a priority. That came about when public health came back into the council from the health sector, and there was a real elevation of health inequalities as a driver for council activity. So reducing poverty and inequality became the #1 priority of Gateshead Council. So they were looking around for people to help drive that agenda, and the obvious place to land with that was Citizens Advice. The advantage of working in this way, where we have a dual role, is that I can bring data into the council in real time. So a lot of the activity that the council does, it's lag data that it has. It's always looking in the rear view mirror. But by working in this way, we're getting real time data and intelligence. And that told us as early as June that we needed to do something about warm spaces. So my dual role is there's a number of facets to it. It's obviously tackling poverty and inequality, but it's also about looking to see how the council can use its assets to better support voluntary sector activity. So it can't give grants to the extent that it used to, but it still has a huge amount of assets that it can share with its voluntary sector partners. So looking to see how it uses its buildings, how it uses its resources, how it uses its transport infrastructure, its professional skills, its land, its contacts, its economic buying power, procurement, all of those things, how that can better enable the voluntary sector. And then the reverse of that is, how can the voluntary sector support the council to achieve its objectives? So constantly looking to connect the voluntary sector with opportunities in local government. And a great example of that is COVID. So the council started the COVID initiative off very much with itself at the centre, but actually we were able to flip that. And it was our voluntary sector that ultimately provided the emergency response during COVID, and the council just provided a bit of infrastructure underneath it. So that's a very practical example of how it's worked.
Brilliant, thanks Alison. And I think what kind of struck me when we had our chat last week was the fact that that dual role meant that the planning for this project was actually happening way before kind of perhaps other councils were thinking about it, or it became a mainstream idea because of that information that you were getting through your other role and able to feed that into the council in real time.
Yeah, so to give you an example of that, in June, we had one of the highest contact rates for payment meter disconnections in June. Now, that wasn't because people had their heating on, that was because people were just living their lives. They were getting washed, they were using their washing machine, they had their lights on, but they weren't heating their homes. And yet we had huge numbers of people choosing to self-disconnect in the summer. So we were able to feed that into the planning process and get people thinking about what needed to happen in the winter.
Brilliant. So could you tell us a little bit more about your Warm Spaces project and how it works, please?
Yeah, so for us, Warm Spaces is not necessarily bringing additional resource into our network. There is some additional resource, but it's actually the rebranding and reconfiguration of existing resource in a lot of cases. And There is some very obvious minimum standards for a warm space. It mustn't be cold, and that might seem really obvious, but some of the buildings and organisations that have stepped forward have buildings that are very old and very drafty and not necessarily conducive to a warm space. So they've got the will, but not necessarily the infrastructure to be able to provide the warm space. There must be a free hot drink available at a warm space. There must be a warm welcome. The participating agencies must be included in our online digital directory. They must display and adhere to the values and beliefs set out in our Warm Space Charter, which was created in collaboration with the Gateshead Poverty Truth Commission. And they must take part in some mandatory training that we have created, because we recognised very early on that not all of the agencies that were stepping forward to be warm spaces had a particularly deep history of dealing with the sorts of people that might turn up at a warm space, actually. So we created a mandatory training module within which we look at things like how to get your venue ready, how to have difficult conversations, how to de-escalate conflict, how to make every contact count, what it means for people to be living in a cost of living crisis. Because you can imagine on a cold December day, it's bleaching down with snow, somebody's sat there all day, it's 5 o'clock and the agency wants to close. How do they have that conversation with somebody about it's time to go now, knowing that they're sending them back to that cold space? So it was really important that we supported our agencies to really understand what they were letting themselves in for, to give them some tactics and some nudges as to how they could deal with that. But the idea for warm spaces really came about as we were thinking about what we wanted to do. We recognised that we were never going to be able to afford to pay for all of the infrastructure required to create a warm space. So we started to think about how we could collaborate. And we latched on to the dementia friend idea. So if you think about the dementia friendly society, they have created tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of dementia friends across the United Kingdom. And they've done that despite the fact that they have no control or ownership over any of the assets or resources that they've trained. So we came up with this idea of creating a concept and a brand and an idea, but also recognising that we would need the agencies who were providing that to respect their autonomy. So Warm Spaces is a bit like the Dementia Friend brand. There is an idea, there's a way of doing it, there's a brand, there's a belief system, but there's also absolute integrity and autonomy for the individual organisations to be able to bring their own flavour into it, you know, as long as they're adhering to the minimum standard. So again, we were putting ourselves back in the role of enabler of voluntary sector activity, much in the same way as we did during the pandemic. It was the voluntary sector that provided the resources and the support, and we provided the infrastructure. So again, repeating that pattern of really good collaboration with voluntary and community sector. And we did have some conversations about how we would use council buildings, but we decided that they would be our place of last resort rather than our place of first resort. Because we also know from COVID that it was the grassroots organisations that had the biggest success in reaching the most vulnerable and disempowered in our communities, and we wanted to repeat that success again. So we do have some council buildings, but they are primarily voluntary and community sector buildings. The council buildings that we do use are more leisure focused library type facilities and look less corporate perhaps than some of our older style buildings.
Brilliant, thank you. And so just like some kind of basic details really on the programme. So what goes into setting up a warm space, or the warm space that you've set up? What timelines did you work to? How many partners have you got working on it? Yeah. You know, how many kind of warm spaces, what's the offer look like to residents?
Yeah, so we started thinking about this in June, and we had our first warm spaces go live around the middle of September. So we went out with an expression of interest in August. And again, we did get some raised eyebrows. It was very hot in August, if you remember, and a lot of people were saying to us, well, why on earth are you thinking about warm spaces? You should be thinking about ice banks, not warm banks, because you'll remember we had a few days where we had heat warnings. And we did think about that really carefully about whether the timing was right, but we knew that if we didn't do it, we wouldn't have our warm spaces up and running for the winter. And we were really sure that we were in for a winter of discontent. So we just pressed ahead anyway. We didn't have a huge amount of money. We used the Household Support Fund to fund our warm spaces. And I do think one of the lessons learned is that warm spaces sits in the grey of Household Support Fund. Actually, it's not a perfect fit for that, but it was the only money that we had available to us. We also knew that we couldn't afford to pay the full cost recovery of all of the warm spaces. So we were relying on our voluntary sector organisations becoming a coalition of the willing, recognising the need and being willing to come with us on this journey, but we didn't know for sure that they would. In conceptualising the idea, we started to talk to citizens' advice, obviously. We also talked to our Council of Voluntary Service, which in Gateshead is Connected Voice, about how we could maximise the take up from the voluntary and community sector, and they gave us some really practical tips around the expression of interest, actually, because it started off being a bit of a dissertation on all things fuel poverty, and actually we got it down to about four sides of A4 in the end. But they gave us simple tips, like the first iteration, it was called a warm space network rather than a network of warm spaces, which is where we landed. And their feedback to us was that if we call it a warm space network, there will be a fear from agencies that they are somehow getting themselves into an ongoing programme of meetings and having to meet together to share information. And for £500, you simply can't expect that from your voluntary and community sector. So it was really simple things like that. So getting the wording right, getting the presentation of it right, really making it sound like it was a collaboration and it wasn't simply that the council was sort of drawing from the voluntary sector. That was really, really helpful. But for us, the magic bit of fairy dust, I think, the thing which is maybe makes us stand out from others is the work that we did with our Gateshead Poverty Truth Commission. So yes, we had the idea in an office about a warm bank, and there's always a criticism that it's going to be top down, and that you're going to create something that people don't want. So we tested it with people who had lived experience of poverty. We went to them and talked about the idea, and again they gave us some fantastic feedback about the sorts of things that would encourage people to use the space, the things that would discourage them from using the space, and again how to present the branding in a way that people felt was inviting. So again, we could have said Gateshead Council warm spaces, we could have said Gateshead warm banks, but actually we created a brand that looked very community focused, very friendly, very warm, and not council-y. I'm sure those of you that work in the council will know what I mean by that. They helped us with that, but they also helped us to create our warm space charter, in which we set out the values and beliefs of what it means to run a warm space, what it means to go into a warm space, and the created some red lines. So you go into a warm space in Gateshead and nobody will ever ask you why you are there. You go into a warm space in Gateshead and you will not be fined housing officers or Revs and Bens officers or any sort of creditor there that might be wanting to have a conversation with you about your situation. Now, there are some warm space models where they are creating service hubs and they are equally valid, but that's not what we wanted in Gateshead. We wanted a network of places where people could go in psychological safety without fear that anybody was going to be speaking to them about any of the problems. But at the same time, we wanted our warm spaces agencies to understand where to send people if those conversations did come up, because you walk into a warm space, you're not separated from your problems, and it's possible as trust develops that these conversations will start to happen. That's why we did the training. So the Poverty Truth Commission was really, really important to us in setting that up. All of that collaboration did take a lot of time. So, we started in June. It was probably towards the second half of August before we were in a position to put out an expression of interest. But again, we kept that really, really light touch. It's not a traditional grant run or a commission. it was again another Microsoft form in which we just asked a number of questions, very light touch, about who are you, what do you currently do, why are you interested in a warm space, and how do you think it'll operate for you, and if we give you £500, what will you spend it on? And people chose to spend it on all sorts of different things. Some people wanted to buy soft furnishings, some people wanted a tea urn, some people were going to put it towards their gas and electricity costs. But for us, when we're monitoring the warm spaces, we're not monitoring what they've spent the money on. It's £500. To be frank, I'm not really interested in that. I'm interested in how their warm space is operating, how many people are coming into it, what's their experience of reaching out to people. That's what we are monitoring and evaluating. So really light touch. It took a bit of negotiation internally to get us to a place where that form could be as light touch as it was, because, you know, again, we revert back to our ways of doing things. And one of my observations as someone who's very new into local government is that we put the same amount of bureaucracy around and red tape around a £500 payment as we do around a £250,000 payment. The levels of risk are entirely disproportionate. So, you know, just being a little bit disruptive and challenging some of those behaviours. Another example of that was when we spoke to legal about how we would manage the grant agreement. It was a 40-page grant agreement that we got sent for a £500 payment. So again, just challenging that. And in the end, we got it down to 2 sides of A4, and it's now an offer letter rather than a formal grant agreement.
Because I ask Alison, for just a few people that might be on the call that are maybe experiencing similar challenges, how did you actually convince them that it needed to go from 40 to 2 pages, and that the monitoring didn't need to be as perhaps strict as it would be for bigger amounts?
Well, firstly, I'm very, very tenacious and not at all willing to accept my first answer. So I think that, you know, that is absolutely key. It takes a certain type of personality, because I'm sure there are many people who would have just received that 40-page grant agreement and sent it out. But I am also the chief officer of a voluntary sector organisation, actually, and that insight about you are giving these people £500, it makes, you know, it's good. You're going to spend the £500 on making them read the 40 pages, because it's going to take them a half a day to get through that. So just being really tenacious. But then I also am a pragmatist, and I found key players in the system that were sympathetic to me, to include some very influential cabinet members who I went to and said, surely we're not going to make them do this in return for this. And, you know, once your deputy leader steps into the space, there's not going to be much that's going to get in the way of that. So really being tenacious, really talking to them about risk and actually the proportionality of some of the measures, reminding them of all of the great things that we did in COVID, where all of that bureaucracy and red tape was thrown out of the window, and yet no wheels fell off. Everybody played their part, didn't they, in a really great way. And we have likened in Gateshead the cost of living crisis to COVID, actually, such is the extreme nature of what our communities are going through. In Gateshead, we have made a cost of living motion in which we're declaring it as an emergency. So when you bring all of that pressure to bear, people just rolled over in the end and went, wow, okay, that's the way we'll do it.
Thanks, Alison. I'm aware, obviously, people will have questions, and so please do start to feel free putting those in the chat. So I'm going to ask one last question from me, and then I'm going to kind of go over to some of the questions that people in the room are asking in the chat. So the last question from me is, I'd love to just hear a little bit more about some of the details of the types of projects that are being run as warm spaces. And I think you mentioned last week, I don't know if you had the chance, I don't want to put you on the spot too much, but there was one warm space that had like 60 or 70 people attend, and whether you managed to find out a little bit more information about what that offer was.
Yeah, so we've got 75 agencies registered, and we've done a two-pronged thing. So we started off right from the start with two form expressions of interest, one for those agencies that wanted a grant and one for those agencies that wanted to be a warm space but didn't necessarily want a grant. And we've always had those two things available on our website. So even when our grant program closed, agencies continued to register as warm spaces actually. But I was also really clear that just because they'd registered as a warm space, it wouldn't preclude them from getting any subsequent grants that we might have. So we've kept on accepting agencies throughout onto the warm spaces directory. We've got 75 in total. We have some really left field ones, like we've got a bowling club that have stepped in to be a warm space. They've been doing all sorts of weird and wonderful community things, to include having Nerf gun battles with primary school children on their bowling green, where we've got 80 and 90-year-old members of the bowling club in fierce battles with 6, 7, 8 and 9-year-olds. I mean, they're just doing some phenomenal stuff. We've got a cricket club, we've got a rugby club, we've got a hairdressers who's also offering free haircuts, and then we've got the organisations that you would expect, sort of veterans organisations, community groups, village halls, volunteer libraries, a whole range of organisations. But what's really interesting is they're all doing something slightly different. So some are just offering the basic offer in citizens advice. We've created a living room area where we've got plants and tablets for people to browse the internet and soft furnishings. We've got the daily newspaper, up-to-date magazines. We've got book swap available. And people can just come and exist in that space. They can homework in that space. They can do, you know, a whole range of stuff, but they will never be approached by citizens advice for the service. But we've got others that are doing crafts and activities and sing-alongs and bingo and all sorts of different things. So it's a patchwork quilt of offer. We've got some that are for communities of interest that are not generic for the public. So we've got veterans groups, we've got groups for asylum seekers and refugees, we've got some groups for people who are experiencing mental ill health, but the majority of our network is open to the public, so anybody can go. We are relying on the voluntary sector organisations to reach into their communities and get the right people in. So it's been a collaboration of the willing. Everybody's doing something different. I think one of our issues for Gateshead is, though, as a result, we have ended up with a very Monday to Friday 9 to 5 offer, actually. And the next stage of developing our warm spaces has to be to try and understand how we plug those gaps with perhaps a more strategic, identification of the right organisations in the right way.
Thanks, Alison. They are super helpful reflections there. Well, the whole session has been very, very interesting, and I'm seeing stuff in the chat already, people posting how, really interesting and helpful they found it. So thank you ever so much for
having
sharing with us today. So